And I especially want to thank you guys on behalf of my boss, Jesse White, the Secretary of State, who by virtue of his position is not only Secretary of State, but the State Archivist and the State Librarian. So thank you for inviting me and for having me here today. The title of my talk today is A Brief History of Illinois. So we're going to try to get through Illinois history in the space of an hour. And my goal today, I have two goals today. One, to discuss the 200+ year history of Illinois, but also to discuss where I work, the Illinois State Archives, and talk a little bit about some of the material that we have down here in Springfield at the Illinois State Archives. And this is the place where we keep official state records and only official state government records. I'm going to do this presentation based on an online exhibit that we put on 2 years ago for the state's bicentennial, which is still online, and it's called the 100 Most Valuable Documents at the Illinois State Archives. So we're going to go through those documents. I'm going to spend some time with, more time with some of them than with others, but we're going to use those documents as a basis to talk about what I consider to be very interesting history of the state of Illinois. A couple of things I would recommend that you look for as we go through these documents, because in all honesty, I'll probably rush through them a little bit. But look for some of the national themes that you'll see reflected at the state level. I mean, everything from slavery to war to the growth of transportation to national issues like that. But look at those, but look at them and see how Illinois dealt with those kind of issues. And also look a little bit in these documents where Illinois was a leader on some of these issues, where during the height of the Civil War, we sent one of our own to become president. Look to see, you know, how Illinois made these things their own. That's one thing I'd recommend you look for. Since this is based on our exhibit, one of the things I want to tell you about it is I was surprised when we put the exhibit together. We labeled this the 100 Most Valuable Documents, but because we were telling the history of Illinois with this, technically probably not the 100 most valuable documents as defined by eBay. You know, if we did that, it would all be Lincoln documents, and we have 124 Lincoln documents at the Illinois State Archives. But we were telling a story here, and I was surprised at how much of the documents we picked dealt with basic civil liberties, whether it be African-American rights or women's suffrage. And look for that a little bit as we go through this. 8 out of the first 20 documents that we went through directly relate to civil liberties and civil rights. I just found that fascinating, and that wasn't done on purpose. That's just important documents that we have. Because these are state records, we were sometimes a little limited in what we could do. So we don't have a lot on Jane Addams and Hull House, for example. That was a local thing, not a state thing. So we weren't able to do much with that. We don't have a lot on Al Capone and gangsters. Al Capone went to federal prison, not to the state. So we had a few limitations, but overall, I think this exhibit, which I would encourage you to visit a little more in depth after this program, I think this exhibit does capture the state of Illinois and its history pretty well. If you have questions, I think George might have mentioned, you can type them in the Q&A box and I'll try to get to them. You can type them at any time, but I'll try to get to them when the presentation is over. So with that, I'd like to get started. If you go to the Illinois State Archives website and you click on the 100 Most Valuable Documents, this is what you're going to see. This is the introduction to the exhibit, to the online exhibit. And it just tells you a little bit about what we want to do. And I'm going to just show you how to navigate through this. So you enter the exhibit, and this is the very first document that we have. What we tried to do, again, we went chronologically. The first document's from 1801 before statehood. So we go chronologically, but every exhibit of the 100, every document is going to have a title, in this case, Proclamation Creating New Boundaries for St. Clair and Randolph Counties. It's going to have a photo of the document that you can go into, view the document, which we'll do a little, you'll see as we go through these documents how to do that. And then every page is going to have a little background, put the document into context. It's going to have a little section that talks about the document itself, which is the reason why the document's here. To me, that's obviously very important. And then every page will have a note at the end, which will usually say where the document is in terms of the state archives. Sometimes it'll say why the state archives has that document if it doesn't seem like the kind of document we would have, or sometimes it'll just have an extra little factoid that we couldn't fit in everywhere else. So let's get started with the history of Illinois. And the first 3 documents deal with pre-statehood. Illinois became a state in 1818. In 1800, before we were a state, we were part of the Indiana Territory. And before that, of course, we were part of the Northwest Territory, the Northwest Ordinance, which, and remember this, outlawed slavery, because that'll become an issue as we go through this exhibit. In 1800, the Indiana Territory was created, which included all of the Northwest Territory except Ohio, which was on its way to becoming a state. And then Illinois became its own territory in 1809, and it included all of present-day Illinois, plus all of Wisconsin and parts of Minnesota. So Illinois, while it was a territory, extended from the Ohio River all the way to the Canadian border. But in 1801, we were part of the Indiana Territory, and this document, I'll show you how you view a document. You can click on it, you can zoom in, just creates two counties for what later became the state of Illinois, St. Clair and Randolph counties. St. Clair County, Randolph County was the lowest part of the state. Today it's 18 counties, but it was the bottom third, the bottom fourth of the state. St. Clair County extended from around St. Louis all the way up to the Canadian border. Those are the two counties that were created. What's interesting about this document is if you look at it, and I hope I don't make you dizzy as I scroll through this, the governor of Indiana was William Henry Harrison. There's his name there, who eventually became president of the United States. But he was the governor of the Indiana Territory. The next two documents, Illinois, of course, was settled by Europeans, first by the French in the 1700s. Control of the land eventually went to Great Britain, and then, of course, to the United States, where Illinois became, again, a territory and eventually its own state. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the Europeans were the first ones here. Native Americans lived here. And as the settlers moved in, you began, obviously, to have clashes and conflict. And the territorial government of Illinois, Illinois became its own territory in 1809, had to find ways to deal with the Native Americans who were living here and the natural conflict that you were going to have as the Europeans came in and took their land. So this is just a bill passed by the territorial legislature that prohibits trade with Native Americans. They were scared people would trade with Native Americans, especially in guns. So this actually outlaws trade. If you view this document in the exhibit, you can, the picture here is the bills back then were kept basically in jackets and envelopes. And then this would be the handwritten bill. And of course, you can always zoom in. So this bill passed the House and the Senate. It would have been signed by the president of what they called the council back then, as well as the Speaker of the House. And it would have been signed by the governor, the territorial governor, who was Ninian Edwards. But that, again, regulating trade with the Native Americans. The next document is the same thing. They quickly discovered, well, you can't ban trade with the Native Americans. I mean, it's just impossible. So they legalized trade, but they decided to regulate it. And if you were going to trade with Native Americans, you had to sign a bond. And so we have bonds. Let me get back to that. So we have bonds for people who would trade with the Native Americans. What's interesting about this, again, if you view the document, this bond was given to a person named Andrew St. John, who I don't know much about, and also a person named Shadrach Bond, who eventually became the first governor of the state of Illinois. Oftentimes when you go through documents, you'll see things like that. An ordinary bond, but especially early in Illinois history, you'll see people who went on to, for lack of a better word, bigger or better things. So those are three documents I just wanted to show you to demonstrate Illinois does have, or the State Archives has pre-statehood records. The next three documents I want to talk about deal with Illinois becoming a state in 1818. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful story on how Illinois became the 21st state. So we were the frontier, obviously, back in 1818. We had a delegate to Congress named Nathaniel Pope. He wasn't a representative because we weren't a state, but he was a delegate because territories get delegates to Congress, and they kind of observe, and they really don't have much to do because mail between Illinois and Washington, D.C. would take 3-4 months. Well, he's at his office minding his own business when a letter comes from Illinois and it says, the territorial legislature just passed a resolution, we want to become a state. And it took him completely by surprise, but he was good. He was real good. So he took the petition to Congress, and Congress took up the issue, and they said, we should form a committee. Who's going to be in charge of the committee? And Nathaniel Pope, who wasn't even a representative, said, I'll do it. And they said, sure. So he was in charge of the committee designed to draft legislation to make Illinois a state. Now, I always say there's a right way to do things, there's a wrong way to do things, and there's the Illinois way to do things. And Nathaniel Pope was the perfect definition of the Illinois way to do things. So he drafted the legislation in charge of this. And the legislation said for Illinois to become a state, you need three things. You need to take a census, and it needs to have 60,000 people population. You need to pass a constitution that's going to pass muster with Congress, and you need to form a government. Well, the first thing we were going to do is take a census. However, we didn't have 60,000 people in Illinois. We probably didn't even have 40,000. But Nathaniel Pope was in charge of the committee creating the legislation, and he was able to get Congress to agree that instead of 60,000, we'll just have 40,000 for the census. If we can make 40,000, we can become a state. We didn't have 40,000 either, but Nathaniel Pope also did something that was interesting in the committee. Who takes the census? It's the federal government. But Nathaniel Pope said, you know what? You guys are busy. Washington is far, far away from Illinois. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll do the census for you because that's the kind of nice guys that we really are. Well, since and Congress bought it, and we were nice guys. We were so nice, we would count people 2, sometimes 3 times. Illinois was settled from the south to the north. So most of the people in Illinois, first of all, were Southerners, which becomes important later, but most of the people lived south of St. Louis. And the eventual border for Illinois obviously was going to go all the way to Wisconsin. Very few people lived there. It was very hard to get there. So they would guess. It's like, well, I heard there were 3 people living in Woodridge. 3, or did you hear 6? Well, I heard 10. Well, why don't we round it up to 20? And that's how they did the census. Or if you were passing through the state of Illinois from Indiana to Missouri, and you happened to be in the eastern part of Illinois, they'd count you. And if you got to the central part, they'd count you. If you got to the western part, they'd count you. At the end of the day, we have a census. This is the census that made us a state that had 40,258 people. 2 years later, the federal government did its decennial census. It's every 10-year census. We're doing one right now, and I hope you've all filled out your census forms. And the federal government issued a report that said, yeah, they probably only had 34,000 people in Illinois at the time. But we have the census reports. It's not complete, that I guess show we had 40,000. Again, we were put in charge of it, and this is how we did it. What's interesting about a census, which makes for great genealogical records, every census they ask different questions. This census, all they wanted to know, it was about the population. So all they really wanted to know was the names of the head of the family, which you'll see here, how many free white males over the age of 21 lived in the household. In this case, it's 3. And then how many of everybody else, children, women, minorities like African Americans, whether slave or indentured servant, 7. So women are really not mentioned by name here, with the exception of if they were the head of the household. And of course, the only way a woman was the head of the household back then would be like the widow Loom here, or the widow McCoy, or the widow Anderson. So all I can figure out is the only way women back then could be the head of the household was if their first name was widow. Okay, so we hit the first requirement. We passed the census. Now we had to form a government. Now we had to pass a constitution. Delegates were elected. They went to Kaskaskia, a tiny town that was the territorial capital. It was on the Mississippi River. It washed away in, I think, the 1890s. It was on the Mississippi, about 80 miles south of St. Louis. And why was it on the Mississippi? Because Illinois was the frontier. We really didn't have roads. The only way to get around the state was by rivers, and very few Indian trails, Native American trails. That's another reason Illinois was settled from the south to the north. The only good way to get to Illinois was down the Ohio River. There's mostly Southerners from Virginia, the Carolinas, and Kentucky who took advantage of that. The Great Lakes at that point, with the mode of transportation, the types of boats, they didn't have steamboats back then, paddle wheels, people wouldn't take the Great Lakes. So Illinois, again, started off as a southern state. And this Constitution reflects it. On the one hand, it's extremely liberal. It had the most liberal voting rights of any state. And by that I meant if you were 21 and a white male, we're not crazy liberal, I guess, but if you were 21 and a white male, you could vote in Illinois if you'd lived here for 6 months. You did not even have to be a citizen of the United States. Illinois was fairly empty back in 1818, so they didn't want to put that requirement in. That became a big issue in the 1830s and 1840s as we started to get immigrants, especially Irish immigrants, who were digging the I&M Canal and voting straight Democrat. But in 1818, there was not even a citizen requirement to vote, and that wasn't changed until the 1848 Constitution. So we have this Constitution, which is very liberal. It's based on the Constitution in New York. It's very liberal in a lot of ways. Beautiful handwriting. I'm going to view the document real quick. Zoom in. This is the front page. These are all the different pages. This is another beautiful page, in my opinion. This is the signature page. There were 15 counties in Illinois, up from the 2 from 1801. Today there's 102 counties. The last county in Illinois was created in 1859, Ford County, just north of Champaign. But at the time of the Constitution, there were 15 counties, and these are the elected representatives to the Constitutional Convention from those 15 counties. One problem with this Constitution, certainly a major problem, the French had brought slaves into Illinois. The Southerners had brought slaves into Illinois, and slavery was in Illinois, even though the Northwest Territory said you can't have slaves in the Northwest Territory. The Constitution had to draw a fine line because the framers of the Constitution, many of them were slave owners and wanted to keep their slaves, but they knew they couldn't get the state constitution passed by Congress if it said slavery. So they kind of tiptoed around the issue. Well, 34 Northern congressmen caught on to what they were trying to do and said, well, you've grandfathered slavery in for the French. You've allowed slaves to be at the salt mines, which is a horrible, horrible job to have here in Illinois. And you really haven't outlawed slavery. It's just not as blatant as it is down south. So 34 congressmen voted against admitting Illinois to the Union because the Constitution did not do enough to limit slavery. But 34 wasn't a majority. And on December 3rd, 1818, the Senate had voted to admit Illinois. The House had, even with the 34 against it, and President Monroe on December 3rd, 1818 signed the legislation to make us a state. The third thing we had to do before we became a state was form a government. And so this document is just election returns from the first election, which was held in the fall of 1818. And all it says in these election returns, there were no political parties back then. There were just factions. So you had a faction for a man named Jesse Thomas and a faction for a man named Ninian Edwards. And there were 2 Senate seats up that the legislature was going to appoint, and Thomas and Edwards got together and they each took one of the Senate seats. Then they both liked Shadrach Bond for governor, so he ran unopposed. And then the only other statewide election in 1818 was for lieutenant governor, where Pierre Menard was elected. So this is just election results. And again, on December 3rd of 1818, we became a state. What's interesting about this is we also elected a state legislature, and we're not a state yet. So the legislature met, took care of administrative duties like appointing the 2 US senators. And then someone said, we should start passing some laws because the legislature, that's what you do. But for the first session of the General Assembly in Illinois, they didn't pass any laws, which was really hard for them not to do, but they realized they wouldn't have any effect. They're not a state. And so they waited until the second session, which was held after statehood. So the first bill passed by the General Assembly as we entered the statehood period was this bill. Again, everything's handwritten back then. There's the jacket that it was in. And all this handwritten bill does is say, if we haven't passed a law about it, then English common law is the law of the land. So if we haven't gotten around to passing a law outlawing this, but it's outlawed under English common law, then it's illegal. So this, just a fascinating document. This document, again, it's 101 or 201 years old right now. If you zoom in, you'll see it's signed by the Speaker of the House, John Messenger, by the Speaker of the Senate, Pierre Menard, who is also the Lieutenant Governor, and then signed by Shadrach Bond, the first governor of the state. So that's the first law. A recurring theme, like I told you, is civil rights. And we passed a series of laws before the Civil War called black laws, which are laws that were designed to discriminate against African Americans. We did have some free African Americans who lived in Illinois, and we had slavery really until the 1840s in a limited way in Illinois. And these laws were designed to knock down their freedoms. They would do things like say they can't serve on juries, they can't testify against white men, they can't serve in the militia. There'd be other strict rules as well. And Illinois wasn't the only state to have black laws that discriminated like this. Most states in the North did have black laws, but Illinois through the years would have the worst and most discriminatory black laws of any northern state. And we'll get back to that issue a couple of times because that's an important, if sad, part of Illinois history. The first capital was Kaskaskia, a tiny town on the Illinois River. Illinois, at the Constitutional Convention, not one of the delegates lived north of St. Louis because northern Illinois had not been settled. You really couldn't get there. There were no roads, no bridges. You had to take rivers. That's why every town in Southern Illinois will say at one point or another, you know, we used to be bigger than the city of Chicago. Well, of course you did. You were founded in the early 1800s. Chicago didn't become a village until 1833. So you'll hear that from downstate Illinois. But nevertheless, people in Illinois and certainly the government officials knew that the population eventually was going to extend north. So Vandalia is 80 miles north of Kaskaskia, more in the middle of the state. It's still on a river, the Kaskaskia River actually. But it's in the middle of the state if you define the middle between Indiana and Mississippi River, but it's still in the southern part of the state compared to Cairo and the Ohio River and Wisconsin. One of the interesting things about this, the Secretary of State, setting precedent, hired his, I believe it was his nephew, paid him $25 to move the state papers, including what the small archives would have been then, but paid his, I believe again, his nephew, his 20-year-old Sidney Breeze, paid him to move all the state records to Vandalia. So you see early patronage. But even more important, Sidney Breeze, this 20-year-old, would be around in state government and politics for the next 50 years, becoming a US Senator, Supreme Court Justice, and really one of the most notable Illinoisans of the 19th century. So while we did have slaves, we never had a lot of African Americans here. We did have slaves, and we also had free blacks as well. Yet another civil rights issue. This is a document certainly I wasn't aware of, but in 1822, African Americans petitioned the General Assembly for the right to vote. They said they were free. I'll show you the document. Here's the signature page. But they said they were free, they paid taxes, they worked their land, they were property owners, and they should have the right to vote. In the appeal, it says, "It is true we are black, and it is true you are white. We have not made ourselves, but have been put into existence by the supreme ruler of the universe, like all of the other colors which comprise the human family." I don't know how you can ignore an argument like that, but the General Assembly ignored it. And African American males did not get the right to vote in Illinois until 1870. So the French were the first ones to come to Illinois, and the first explorers were Joliet and Marquette, Louis Joliet and Father Marquette. And they came down Lake Michigan, went through, I think, the Wisconsin River in Wisconsin to the Mississippi, and they went down the Mississippi most of the way down to New Orleans. They didn't go all the way. When they came back, they were told, you know, there's a shortcut. Instead of going all the way up the Mississippi to Wisconsin, just take a right here on the Illinois, then you take a right on the Des Plaines River, then you have to do a portage. You have to carry your stuff for about 20 miles, you get to the Chicago River, and then boom, you're in Lake Michigan. When they did that in the 1700s, they realized, wow, they should build a canal here and connect the Chicago River to the Des Plaines River, and you'll have a connection from the Atlantic Ocean to the St. Lawrence to the Great Lakes, through the rivers and canals to the Mississippi and New Orleans. Well, for 150 years that was talked about. And then after Illinois became a state, the canal began to become a reality, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which is located not too far actually from Woodridge. And this is an early map just showing the proposed canal route, which is this area here. This is Lake Michigan there. And all they're saying here is the canal should go somewhere in here. It was eventually built. It was built in the 1830s, opened in 1848. The canal actually technically was a success. It was a big time for building canals, and most of them failed. This canal paid for itself. It was in use actually until 1933, but it was never the great success they thought it was going to be, because after it opened in 1848, the railroad had been invented, and slowly but surely that took away more and more of the canal's importance. Okay, so I want to get back to slavery. This is one of the most important issues in early Illinois, not because it led to the Civil War, but because of how it affected Illinois itself. You had Southerners running state government. Shadrach Bond, as governor, was limited to one term. The Constitution said the governor could only serve one term. So 1822, we have an election for governor, and there's 4 candidates. 2 of them are pro-slavery, and the only real issue in the whole campaign, again, the kind of thing that's not really known in Illinois history, but the only issue in the campaign is, should Illinois become a slave state? 2 candidates were all for Illinois becoming a slave state. A third candidate was kind of wishy-washy on it, and then a 4th candidate was a guy named Edward Coles. He was a Virginia plantation owner who had the travel bug. He was brilliant. He had been James Madison's personal secretary. His brother had been Thomas Jefferson's personal secretary. And, but he wanted to travel. He wanted to go to the frontier, so he came to Illinois. The other thing you have to know about Coles was he hated slavery. He was strongly anti-slavery. So he came to Illinois and he freed his slaves. There's actually a painting of that in the Capitol building across the street from me right here. And he freed his slaves. 1822, he runs for governor, and he only gets 34% of the vote in a campaign where slavery is the big issue. That means that 2/3 of the state were voting for pro-slavery candidates. But in a four-way race, 34% gets you elected. So Coles, the anti-slavery candidate, is elected as governor. Okay, but the pro-slavery candidates own the House and the Senate. So they just really 6 years after the Constitution, after we became a state, they decided to call a constitutional convention with the only purpose of making Illinois a real slave state like it was down south. The bill passed the House or passed the Senate, and then it went to the House where it needed 24 votes, okay, to call a constitutional convention, and then the voters had to approve it. On the first vote, this is the roll call, and on the first vote, it got 22 votes, so it didn't make it. So they called it again. This time it got 23 votes. 2 people who voted against the convention voted for it, so it should have had 24, and it should have passed and gone to the voters. But this person, Nicholas Hansen, who had voted for the convention on the first ballot, voted against it, knocked it down to 23. Vandalia, which was the capital at the time, was lit up that night with a number of effigies of him that were burned. People were amazingly, obviously upset, the pro-slavery people. And it was a very violent time. Again, you're on the frontier. But the thing about Hansen was he had won his election in a disputed election that the House had to decide who the winner was, and they had decided Hansen had won. And then he voted this way. So they looked at that decision and said, you know what, actually, maybe we made a mistake and the other guy won. And the other guy just happened to be in Vandalia. So the other guy, a man named Shaw, within a day took Hansen's place, and Hansen was kicked out of the House because, according to the House now, he didn't win his election. They took a vote the next day, and here's the roll call, the pre-printed ballot. You can see Hansen's name is crossed out, and you can see Shaw's name is written in, and he votes for the Constitutional Convention. Just a nice little Illinois political trick there. The Constitutional Convention is passed. It goes to the voters, and Edward Coles, the governor, leads the charge against it. This thing which was going to pass. If you think about what would have happened had it passed, had Illinois become a slave state, it would have split the country up at a time 9 years after the War of 1812. We weren't ready for anything like that. It would have blown the country apart. Edward Coles spent his own money, hired his own people, bought his own newspapers, and campaigned against the Constitutional Convention and was able to beat it. So we didn't have a convention. We didn't become a state. The next legislature that was elected was more pro-slavery. But this document, the way they got the Con passed, I just find, I don't want to say it sums up Illinois politics, but it's a great Illinois political story. Coles is one of the unsung heroes of the country, really, because he saved the country. And how was he rewarded? Well, if you remember, he freed his slaves when he came to Illinois, and under that 1819 black law, that was illegal. So he was sued. He beat the case in court. The legislature now was anti-slavery, and they had basically passed a law that would absolve him of any crimes. So he beat it, but eventually he was chased out of Illinois and he moved to Philadelphia. He lived till 1869, this strong anti-slavery man, lived to 1869, which was long enough to see the slaves freed in the Civil War, but it was also long enough to see his son killed in the Civil War, fighting for the South, because his son was still a Virginian, so he was fighting to preserve slavery. Again, an unsung Illinois hero. Since we're on the story of on the topic of sad topics, this is a transcription of a speech given by the Indian chief Kennecott. Kennecott led a band of the Kickapoo tribe, and he really westernized. He adopted, and his tribe adopted, agricultural techniques, clothing, even religions of the West. But by the 1830s, the conflict between the settlers and Native Americans was coming to a head. The next year, you'd have the Black Hawk War. And there's more and more pressure to kick the Native Americans out of Illinois, which is eventually what happened. This is a transcript of a speech that he gave to William Clark, who was the Indian Affairs agent at the time. And William Clark, of course, is famous as being part of Lewis and Clark. He was obviously the Clark of it. So in this speech, Again, this is a transcription of it. It's sad because you can just see he doesn't understand why his tribe has to be kicked out. And he states, God has told me, God has not told me to go on the other side of the Mississippi, but to stay here and mind my religion. And he refers to Clark as his friend because Clark is his friend, but there's nothing Clark can do. And then the next year there's the Black Hawk War. It doesn't involve this tribe, but it doesn't matter. And the Kickapoo tribes are kicked out of Illinois. It's a very heart-wrenching type of a document to see that. All right, so we have gone through pre-statehood, we've gone through statehood, and what I call early statehood. Now we're going to get into the pre-Civil War era, and we're going to start with the Black Hawk War. Abraham Lincoln has moved from Indiana to Illinois with his parents. They moved to Decatur. He eventually moved to New Salem, and in 1832, he'd been there a year. And the Black Hawk War breaks out. Back then, states fought wars with state militias, and if the federal government came in, you didn't join the federal army like you do today. You joined the state militia, and the militia would be federalized by the federal government, which is what happened here. This is a state militia muster roll for the Black Hawk War. The other thing that happened back then is the officers were elected by the men. So in this muster roll, you see Captain Abraham Lincoln. He was elected by his men to be the captain of this unit, which mostly came from the New Salem area where he lived at the time in Sangamon County, which is where Springfield is. In his later days when he was running for president, he referred to this election by his neighbors and friends as probably the most satisfying election he'd ever had, which is a pretty high compliment for a person who'd been elected to the legislature, to Congress, and to President of the United States. But he said this was the most satisfying election he ever had. I had mentioned Chicago incorporated in 1833. This is a land plat for the city of Chicago. Let's see if you can recognize it. This is the Chicago River. This is where the courthouse is. This is Dearborn Street here. So you'll notice there's no State Street, there's no Michigan Avenue, there's no Columbus Drive, there's no Lakeshore Drive, there's no Grant Park. The lake, this is all swamp. The Chicago River, which now goes straight into the lake and has Navy Pier up here, back then hooked into a sandbar and was really difficult to navigate in here. So it's an early plat. Why did they need plats? Because all of these plots were going to be sold to pay for the I&M Canal. So that's why you had plats. There's a couple things also to look at here. Where the courthouse is today is called public land. And not on this map, but on future maps, this area is also called public land. And that'll be important in the future of the lakefront because public land cannot be built on. And we'll talk about that with a later document. In the meantime, if you wonder how they were able to get the land here to get things like Grant Park and Lakeshore Drive, obviously they use landfill through the years. When they tear down a building, they dump it over here. And the biggest landfill that they got, of course, was 1871. When the Chicago fire happened, a lot of the debris, the bricks, you know, from the crumbled buildings, the wood, a lot of the debris was dumped here and the lakeshore expanded into Lake Michigan. And up here, sedimentation eventually created what's called Streeterville, the neighborhood in Chicago. And there's a very famous story about that as well. So that's City of Chicago incorporating in 1833. The Internal Improvement Act in 1837, and I won't go through this too much. It was an attempt to start to build roads and bridges and railroads in Illinois. It failed, and we were in debt for the next 45 years in Illinois. This is just legislation. This is actually a bond the residents of Springfield put up to move the capital from Vandalia to Springfield, which happened, and the capital is here to this very day. We have the House journals for all the House and Senate, for all the General Assemblies. This is the House Journal entry from 1837, where Abraham Lincoln is quoted as saying what his beliefs of slavery are, which is it's legal in the states that have it, in the federally controlled areas, Washington, D.C. and the territories, it should be banned, and slavery as a whole is bad policy. And that was his policy in 1837 when he was a young state legislator, and that was his policy when he was elected president. This is a document written in Abraham Lincoln's hand. I'll zoom in a little bit. Just when he was a state representative, just informing the Senate that the House had been organized. And it was a very nice document because Lincoln had run for Speaker of the House and had lost. And this must have been a difficult topic or difficult thing for him to write about, because he had obviously wanted it organized with him to become the speaker. So it was very gentlemanly of him to write that document. In the 1840s, the Mormons came to Illinois. They'd been chased out of Missouri, and they settled on the Mississippi in a town called Nauvoo. They became a political force in Illinois. And so they got a lot of what they wanted in Springfield, including the ability to create their own militia, their own court system, their own school system, things that weren't necessarily given to any other town. And it's because they became politically powerful. So this document, the only reason we have this, or that this is here, is to talk about the Mormons. And a lot of the documents in this exhibit give us a chance to talk about Illinois history. This is just them asking for weapons, because they did have a unit in the state militia, so they went down to the armory to ask for weapons. So there's Hiram Smith's signature there, and I see Smith right there, and there's Joseph Smith's signature right there. So that would, I think, would probably be a very valuable document. This is the Articles of Incorporation for the city of Nauvoo. Again, this is the Mormon city. Eventually, the people living near Nauvoo who were not Mormon became scared of the power, and Joseph Smith was assassinated, and the Mormons were chased out of Illinois and settled in Utah, which is Salt Lake City. This is an early court case. Of our 100 documents, we have 10 Illinois Supreme Court cases. This is a court case involving an African American, another civil rights issue. In Illinois, under the black laws, a black person couldn't testify against a white person. In this case, Jarrett was a slave who sued for his freedom. In this court case, Jarrett versus Jarrett, he sued for his freedom. He said slavery is illegal in Illinois. And after 30 years of statehood, the Supreme Court agreed with him. And this was really the death knell for Illinois, for slavery in Illinois. And in 1848, the second state constitution actually did outlaw slavery. But for the first 30 years of statehood, we did have slavery in Illinois. It's pre-Civil War. These are election returns for the 7th Congressional District in 1846. This is a valuable document because one of the candidates was Abraham Lincoln. And you can see he had no troubles beating his Democratic opponent, Peter Cartwright, 6,300 votes to 4,800, and another 200 votes for a anti-slavery candidate. Peter Cartwright was a minister, a very famous traveling minister in central Illinois. He was having a revival during the campaign, and Lincoln stopped by. Peter Cartwright asked the crowd, how many of you think you're going to heaven? And many people, I'm sure, raised their hand. Then he asked how many people in the crowd think they're going to hell. I don't know if people answered that question or not. Lincoln didn't answer either question, so he asked Lincoln, he goes, Mr. Lincoln, where do you think you're going? And Lincoln looked at him and said, I'm going to Congress. And Lincoln defeated him in the election and went to Congress for one term. In 1848, the second Illinois Constitution. In 30 years, the state had changed a lot, and we had a constitutional convention, and again, had our second constitution. We've had 4 in the history of the state. This is the charter for the Illinois Central Railroad. The state is beginning to industrialize, beginning to expand. This railroad, when it was built, was 700 miles long. It went from Cairo on the Ohio River up north, and then it split with one branch going to Chicago and another branch going to Galena. And at 700 miles, it was the longest railroad in the world, in Illinois at that time. This is the final black law. I talked about black laws before. This was passed in 1853. Amazingly discriminatory against African Americans, reinstating all the previous discriminatory black laws, and also saying if you were a free black, you could not emigrate to Illinois, and if they caught you here in Illinois and you'd been here for longer than 10 days, they could basically sell you into slavery, even if you were a free African American. The black laws in Illinois were not repealed until the end of the Civil War in 1865. Another court case, again dealing with African Americans. In this case, the defendant was found guilty of murder, but he couldn't testify against white people. And the court said, in court, African Americans have to be treated the same as whites. This is another Lincoln document that we have, not written by Lincoln, but he was elected to the legislature and declined to serve. The first state university in Illinois, Illinois State, down in Normal, Bloomington Normal now, and this is its incorporation papers. At the time, you're beginning to see government get bigger and bigger. State University is one of them. This is not an overly historic document per se, but this is one of staff's favorite documents. This is a letter to the governor of Illinois from Abraham Lincoln requesting a pardon for two people who had stolen a pig. It's a great document because it shows Lincoln's sense of humor and it shows his honesty. What I like about it is you can see the signature, "Your obedient servant, Abraham Lincoln," which is how he signed most of his documents. Okay, back before 1914, the legislature, not the people, elected U.S. senators. You had to win the vote in the legislature. Again, there was not direct election until the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913. So this is just the House Journal entry, the Lincoln-Douglas debates in the campaign of 1858, where they were actually campaigning for legislative candidates, but it's very famous. And this is the election results in the House Journal from how the General Assembly, the legislature voted to elect Stephen Douglas. Again, we were having social movements. One of the social movements to have was better prisons. This is the prison register, the first one, for the new fancy modern jail in Joliet. And the information, this is the first prisoner in Joliet, Charles White from Effingham, whose crime was larceny. Okay, we have those kind of records. Again, that would be a state record. Okay, we now hit the Civil War period. Fort Sumter is fired upon on April 13th, 1861. The Adjutant General for Illinois issues this order calling for troops. The governor of Illinois, Yates, introduces a proclamation ordering the General Assembly to meet to discuss how we're going to support the war effort. These next two documents are two of my favorites. One of the things that the Adjutant General did was it issued reports having two people organize Illinois units. Again, we fight by state, so Illinois needs to organize units and send them to the federal government. The second person organizing the units, the first one was a colonel, Johnny Smith, but there was this captain who lived up in Galena who'd been to West Point. So they said, well, maybe he knows what he's doing. And so he was given the authority to organize units actually down in Southern Illinois. And of course, his name was Ulysses Grant. So he organized these units and he became an aide to the governor, but Grant wanted to fight. He wanted to be a field commander. And finally, there was this one unit that was kind of troublesome called the 21st. And the governor said, okay, we'll give you command of this unit, the 21st, and we'll promote you to colonel. So this is the muster roll for the 21st Illinois Infantry. And there's the colonel, Ulysses S. Grant. And 4 years later, that colonel was a 4-star general and sitting at Appomattox across from Robert E. Lee. Just a wonderful document. I don't know what else to say when you talk about Illinois history, but our contribution there with Grant. 1860, the Republicans win the state. 1862, the war is going badly, very badly, and the Democrats take control of the legislature. The Democrats don't want to fight this war. They either want to let the South go or they want the South to come back with slavery. And they're trying to do things, and they hate the Emancipation Proclamation. So they're trying to do things to embarrass the president. The Republican governor, the governor was Republican, elected in 1860. So the legislature makes a mistake, and this really, really obscure thing in the Constitution allows the governor to do what is called prorogue, which means he sends them home. He just says, you're going home, you're done. It's what a dictator does. But they had messed up this obscure rule, and he sent them home. And the governor of Illinois governed for almost 2 years without a legislature. He governed without a budget. Okay, he borrowed money. He was a Republican, so he had a lot of rich friends, but he borrowed money to fund state government. He sent the legislature home. It's just an amazing act to take. It's what a dictator does, and but he was obviously done for all the right reasons. Yates is, again, another unsung hero. You could not have Illinois not supporting its troops in the war. Just an amazing piece of legislation. And this is the proclamation saying, go home. The legislature was called in on the last day, what should have been the last day of the legislature. And all they could do is adjourn, and then the next legislature was mostly Republican. And for his effort, Yates was actually elected senator. This is a letter for William Sherman. It's got Sherman's signature on it. That's why we have it. Another civil rights issue. You've seen the movie Lincoln, which talks about the passage of the 13th Amendment in the House. The 13th Amendment, the one that freed the slaves, was written by U.S. Senator Lyman Trumbull, an Illinoisan, and it passed the Senate with no problems. It just had troubles in the House. Once it passed the House, it had to be ratified by the states. So this is a telegram from Trumbull to the governor of Illinois saying, the House just passed the 13th Amendment, make sure Illinois is the first state to ratify it. And that's what Governor Oglesby now at the time did. Illinois became the first state to ratify the 13th Amendment. And the night Illinois ratified it, Lincoln gave a speech praising Congress for passing the 13th Amendment. And in that speech, he proudly said, and by the way, my state was the first one to ratify it, probably at that point the only state, since it happened so quickly. A very proud moment in Illinois history. Following the Civil War, the Union stockyards, some of us who are a little bit older remember the stockyards, at least in their declining days. There were many stockyards in Chicago. Because of the Civil War and the huge demand for meat, eventually they consolidated, and right after the war, they incorporated the Union stockyards in Chicago, eventually earned the moniker of, hog butcher of the world in 1914. It was a huge, huge business on the South Side. This is a Supreme Court ruling. Sometimes the Supreme Court gets it wrong. And in this one, Myra Bradwell, who was a brilliant woman and the editor of the leading legal document or legal newspaper in Illinois, decided to become a lawyer, and she passed the bar, or she passed all the exams. But the court would not admit her to the bar and make her a lawyer because she was a woman. And that's this court case right here. 1870, we passed the third constitution of the state of Illinois. Illinois has changed now. It's a much larger state. We're certainly no longer the frontier. We've got industry, we've got agriculture, we've got immigration issues, transportation issues, and the third constitution in 1870 was designed to handle that. 1871, this is a fascinating piece of legislation, in my opinion. That new constitution said you cannot pass special legislation for any one part of the state, for any municipality. Well, in 1871, Chicago burned down. And the state wanted to, including downstate, wanted to help fund Chicago and help it rebuild, but you can't pass special legislation according to this new constitution. But since 1865, Chicago had been paying money to improve the I&M Canal, $3 million. So the state couldn't appropriate special money to rebuild Chicago, but what it did was it said, that $3 million you paid to fix the I&M Canal, we really should have paid that, so we're going to reimburse you for that. And we were able to divert $3 million to help the city of Chicago to rebuild. It's another court case, very famous. This is the basis of government regulation of utilities. It came through Illinois. Legislation to desegregate the schools, 1874. Census records changed, but we have census records. This is an agricultural census where you ask farmers how much land they have, how much crops they grow, what crops they grow. It's a great genealogical resource if you have a family here in Illinois who used to be farmers. This is a letter to the governor calling for women's suffrage. First state civil rights law was passed in 1885, outlawed discrimination in public places, and for the next 100 years was, in all honesty, mostly ignored, but it was the first step in the right direction. Haymarket was a very famous riot in Chicago. Bomb exploded at a union demonstration, killing 7 police officers. 8 people were arrested for it. The trial was kind of not fair, to say the least. They were sentenced to be hung. This is a letter from Samuel Gompers, a leading union official, just requesting the governor not to hang, not to free them, but not to hang the persons convicted in Haymarket. It's interesting because it's Samuel Gompers who became a famous union person. This is a letter from Daniel Hale Williams to the governor. Daniel Hale Williams was an African-American physician and an Illinois resident who performed the first heart surgery, open heart surgery in the history of the world. So the only reason we included this document was so we could give which is really not an important document, it's just a letter, but we included it because Daniel Hale Williams is a story that people should know about. Women's suffrage was a long, hard road to climb. This is in 1891. The first vote women got in Illinois was to vote in school elections, and this is the legislation to make that happen. I told you we didn't have a lot on Jane Addams. We didn't have a lot on the social movements and the progressive movements in Illinois. And we wanted to tell that story. So one of Jane Addams' cohorts was Florence Kelley, who had been appointed by John Alkeld, Governor Alkeld, a famous Illinois governor, to be a chief factory inspector. And so we have some of her correspondence. So we used this letter from her to the governor to talk about the progressive movement and the Hull House and things like that. Whenever the United States goes to war, the General Assembly pledges the full support of Illinois, and following the sinking of the battleship Maine, that's what this resolution does. This is the muster roll for the 8th Regiment. Again, Illinois and the country is still fighting by state. The 8th Regiment fought in the Spanish-American War. What's interesting about it, it is the 1st regiment that was all African-American. Now, I know you've seen the movie with Matthew Broderick on the 54th Massachusetts, which was an African-American regiment, but it had white officers. The 8th Regiment was all African-American, including the officers, and a great source of pride to the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. A lot of the soldiers in this came from downstate, especially from the Quincy and Alton area. Letter from Teddy Roosevelt to Governor Tanner. This is when Roosevelt was the governor of New York. We include it mostly because it's got Teddy Roosevelt's signature, so you can see his handwriting. That's why, pretty much why, there's a great backstory to that as well, which again, you can certainly read about. The Chicago River was documented in photos when they reversed the river. They reversed the river to send all the sewage in Chicago, including from the stockyards that used to flow into Lake Michigan. They reversed the river and built the canal that connected to the Des Plaines River, pretty well parallel to the I&M Canal, to send all that sewage downstate. Needless to say, downstate didn't like it. So they took photographs both of the reversal of the river and of how downstate really wasn't that badly affected. I live in Illinois. This is an early photo of the Illinois State Fair, a major Illinois event. This is a letter from Robert Todd Lincoln to Richard Yates. We keep it pretty much just because it's dealing with the state's purchase of Lincoln's tomb. This is a great story we talked about earlier, public land on Lake Michigan. Public land defined is a common to remain forever open. Well, through the years, people have tried to build on Lake Michigan, and they tried that in the early 1900s, and Montgomery Ward 4 times went to the Illinois Supreme Court to keep the lakefront open to buildings. And it's still an issue, and there's been some nibbling at the lakefront. You know, you have the Art Institute, you got other buildings. I know recently in Chicago, they had a huge issue with the Star Wars Museum that they wanted to build on the lakefront. These are the court cases that say no, the lakefront is to remain forever open. 1911, we still have a lot of, obviously a lot of racism. Baseball has not been desegregated. One of the great ball clubs of the Negro Leagues was the American Giants out of Chicago. This is their incorporation papers. The first workers' compensation law in Illinois, 1911. You're beginning to see the progressive movement now taking effect with a lot of laws, including, again, workers' compensation. This is the Illinois Suffrage Act of 1913. It gave women the right to vote in presidential elections and local elections, every election but state elections. And this is probably my one regret of a document to put in this exhibit, because I like it. We were the first state east of the Mississippi to have a document like this, but 6 years later, we became the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, period. And I really wish I'd used that document, but I didn't, and I still am wondering why. 1913, the Board of Education documents one-room schoolhouses. This is a one-room schoolhouse down in Jackson County, Illinois. There were requirements of what schoolhouses were to have: separate coat rooms for girls and boys, separate restrooms, of course, which were outhouses back then, and they documented it. And this is just a very attractive school back in 1913, one-room schoolhouse. 1915 is when we got our state flag. This is the law that created it. By World War I, the federal government, you fought the wars, not the states, but we, Illinois, still had one unit, one state militia unit, National Guard unit that fought the 33rd in World War I. And one of the only reason we have this document is because they brought it back. And this is a propaganda poster for Germany. And what it is, it's 1 year's worth, all those little black marks. This is talking about submarine warfare. And all those black marks are the boats that the U-boats sank during World War I in the course of a year in Germany. It was, you can see Schottland and Ireland, it's all in German. And that's the only reason we have this, is this was brought back from the war. Similarly, the 33rd brought back World War I maps. We have maps from really the last 50 days of the war as we close in on Germany. So we have some military maps that the 33rd have. These are top secret, so please don't tell the Germans we have it. It could ruin our World War I effort. But you'll see interesting things, such as Airplanes here. This map doesn't have it, but you'll see gas attacks. You can see the front line. Just really an interesting document, to say the least. And that's the kind of thing, again, we have at the State Archives. This is the ratification of the 18th Amendment. That's the one for prohibition. Illinois has been the home of 3 major race riots: 1908 in Springfield, 1917 in East St. Louis, and 1919 in Chicago. These were in large measures due to the Great Migration, the competition for jobs, obviously just plain racism. This was our document to address it. This is a lengthy coroner's report of the 1919 race riot. We put up a few pages of it. This is an interesting document. I like to think, of course, they're all interesting, but this is an interesting document, making it a felony to do bribery in the case of an athletic contest. It's from 1921. And why would we have a bill like this? Because the legislature is reacting to the 1919 Black Sox scandal. 1925, the worst tornado in the history of the country, passes through southern Illinois. More than 600 people were killed in Illinois, and almost 700 in Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. Just a horrible, horrible tornado. This is a school that was damaged, and we have a photo of it. And this clock is set at 2:37. That's when the tornado came through. Just a horrible, obviously, tornado. All right, cars are invented, and cars are taking over in the 1920s. This was the plan to build the road system, hard roads they called them in Illinois, and this is the plan. 2-lane highways built by the state. You can see very busy by Chicago, and you can see the roads coming down. This would have been what became Route 66. This is legislation to legalize boxing. Boxing used to be illegal in Illinois. This legalized it, which came in handy 2 years later when Jack Dempsey fought Gene Tunney in one of the all-time great fights. It was at Soldier Field in Chicago in front of 100,000 people. We only have one document for the Depression. This created an emergency relief commission. We didn't have much to say about the Depression. It was depressing. But we didn't want to spend a lot of time with it, but that document, obviously very important. A lot of people don't know, Secretary of State's office keeps trademarks. So this is the trademark we use that we keep at the archives. It's for a beer that no longer exists, Old Rockford beer. A special session following Pearl Harbor. This is a great court case here, and I'm going to try to wrap up within the next 5 minutes, George. So again, you see these changes, including the use of the automobile. So in 1942, the city of Bloomington had put in parking meters on its streets, and George Rarick of Bloomington thought those were unconstitutional. These are public streets. How dare you put parking meters on there and charge me 5 cents to park? Well, he didn't pay his meter. He got fined, and he took his case to court. And you always hear about those people who say, I'm going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court. Well, this guy did. And the Illinois Supreme Court ruled on the side of Bloomington. It said, no, it can put meters in. And Mr. Warwick then said, I'm going to take it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And he tried to, but the U.S. Supreme Court did not listen to the case. So it ended with the state Supreme Court. But those issues, it's such an interesting issue that he looked at it as a constitutional issue. Pearl Harbor poster from the Illinois Propaganda Office. What I like about this poster, it's an early poster. It doesn't say remember Pearl Harbor. It says remember December 7th. And the quote, we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, is of course a Lincoln quote from the Gettysburg Address. During the war, for those of you who've seen the movie A League of Their Own, this is a charter. We hold it here at the Illinois State Archives for the American Girls, All-American Girls Softball League, which the Rockford Peaches were a part of. And the owners of the league, Philip Wrigley, who owned the Cubs, and Branch Rickey of the Dodgers, who 4 years later would integrate Major League Baseball. Coal mining, always a big industry in Illinois. This is a report following a disaster of a coal mine in 1947 in downstate Centralia, where 111 miners died. These are the kind of documents that we have at the Illinois State Archives, and that one's used a lot. Again, a Supreme Court case in Illinois. This is an early case about if you can have religion in school. In this case, the Illinois Supreme Court said yes, but the person who sued took it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said no, there's separation of church and state. This is one of staff's favorite bills. The legislature, in its wisdom, passed legislation requiring cats to be on leashes. And Governor Stevenson, the reason we use this is because it gave us a chance to talk about Adlai Stevenson, a famous Illinoisan. But Governor Stevenson vetoes the bill, and he does it in a really humorous way. And he talks about how cats really prefer to work alone. And it's a very, very funny, it really sums up Adlai Stevenson, and it's a great document that way. We don't have a lot of photos here, but we do have the photo collection for the state photographer from the 1940s to the 1980s. This is a picture of Dwight Eisenhower visiting Springfield. He's at the governor's mansion here on his way to the state fairgrounds. That's Governor Stratton. And we just got a large grant to digitize all of the photos in the collection. So those will be online. It'll take a couple of years. But we're thrilled about the grant. This is just Starved Rock, a state institution. If you've never been to Starved Rock State Park, I encourage you to do it. Another Supreme Court case. In this case, if you know the Miranda rights, the Miranda case that went to the US Supreme Court was based on several state court rulings, including this one, about the right to have an attorney that went through Illinois. I'd shown you the map of road projects earlier in the 1920s. Well, now we're building in interstates in Illinois. So this is I-57 being built, and we have some photographs of that. Interstates, again, it's the 1960s, and we've moved to the next generation there. We've had 3 constitutions so far, and then in 1967, after the 1870 Constitution is pushing 100 years old, momentum bills have a constitutional convention, which results in 1970 in the 4th state constitution, which is the constitution that we have today. The 60s and early 70s, a very turbulent time. This is Governor Shapiro calling out the National Guard to respond to the riots at the Democratic National Convention. Illinois, it was illegal under the 1870 Constitution, or not illegal, but you could not pass an income tax. Governor Ogilvie wanted a state income tax, and he did what we call a fireside chat, and these are his remarks. He spoke on over 240 or over 270 radio and TV stations in Illinois. The governor of Illinois, I don't think that could happen today, but making his case to enact a state income tax, and he eventually got it enacted. And then the next constitution made it constitutional to have one. This is just an after action report from the National Guard following Kent State, in this case, talking about the riots at Northwestern University. In 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment, granting women equal rights, came to Illinois to be ratified as part of the US Constitution. It was defeated. It was defeated every year after that. And then as we're putting this exhibit together in 2018, it was passed by the Illinois General Assembly. But the first time it came, this one, it was defeated. This is a tongue-in-cheek resolution that passed. There's a big division in Illinois between Chicago and downstate. This was legislation, a resolution introduced in the Senate to make Cook County the 51st state. And it actually passed the Senate, but it didn't pass the House. And lest you think that's an old issue, there have been 3 similar resolutions introduced in the House over the last decade. This was a resolution in memory of Harold Washington. It gave us a chance to talk about Harold Washington and his importance. 1993, most of you out there probably remember all the flooding. Governor Edgar issued 13 flood-related disaster declarations. The flooding was so bad in Illinois in 1993. And so we put up here 2 of them. By the end, 44 of Illinois' 102 counties were declared disaster areas. That's how bad the flooding was, including, of course, every county along the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Abraham Lincoln, of course, not the only president from Illinois. We don't have much on Reagan. He was born here, but he never served state government. And of course, he did most of his government service outside of Illinois. We have some you saw on Grant, but we do have some stuff on Barack Obama, who was elected 3 times to the state Senate. So this is his oath of office from the first time he was sworn in. There's a signature there. We're very proud of all the Obama stuff that we have here, which, as we entered the age of computers, it's not as much as, we have less stuff of his than we do of Lincoln. When Obama ran for president, of course, you know how the Electoral College works. In December, after the November election, electors by state meet and vote in their state capital, and they're the ones who actually elect the president. So this is, in 2008, we had 21 presidential electors, all pledged to Barack Obama. And this is a ballot electing Barack Obama, voting for Barack Obama for president, as did the other 20 ballots. Don't know what to say about this one. The House votes to impeach Governor Blagojevich in 2009. You know, just because this stuff happened recently doesn't make it obviously less important to history. And these are the impeachment charges against Governor Blagojevich. 1998, we thought it was important to mention that the death penalty had been abolished, and this is the legislation there. In 1999, same-sex marriage was legalized. Again, kind of a civil rights issue, definitely a civil rights issue, and we included the legislation here. And if you view the document, again, it's a several page document. And then we decided we wanted to end the exhibit, and I'll end my presentation here, with what I consider to be possibly the most important document that we have in the Illinois State Archives. We've got 99 very important documents, but this one really speaks to me. And this is the House resolution from 2016 honoring Ben Zobrist and the Cubs for winning the World Series. Whew, I just never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. And it actually honored Zobrist as the MVP of the World Series because he's from Eureka, Illinois. But it also honors the Cubs for winning the World Series, which of course we hope happens again this year. And with that, George, I've run through as much as I could in an hour. I'm exhausted, but I'm happy to look at questions. I hope people enjoyed this presentation, at least so far. And if you are interested in these documents, if you're interested in Illinois history, please visit the Illinois State Archives website and please visit our online exhibit.
Okay, thank you, Dave. That was an excellent presentation. It looks like we're getting some questions here.
I see Kevin Davis has a question. For local school districts, start with the school district. We at the State Archives do have some. We tend to keep local government records. Well, we set up a system of regional archive depositories that are at universities. So if we have local government, local school district records from DuPage County, if they're going to be anywhere, they won't be here in Springfield at the State Archives. They would be at what we call an IRAD, an Illinois Regional Archives Depository at Northern Illinois University. So if they could try there, you can go to the website and see what records they have for DuPage County. So just visit, again, you can get there from our website because they are associated with us. But that's the place to look if the school district itself doesn't have them. And I have a question. Do you have a copy of a Gettysburg Address? You know, that's a good question, and I'll tell you why, because I always use that as an example. We only collect official state records. So the Gettysburg Address, of course, is not a state record, so we don't have a copy of it. And I used to tell people, our mandate is very clear, only state records. So if somebody offered me the Gettysburg Address, I would say no, and I would turn it down. But then I read our statute a little bit more, and the statute was pretty well written by the first archivist. And what it says is we only collect official state records. And I'm paraphrasing here, but then it goes on to say, or anything we think is really cool. And the Gettysburg Address would certainly qualify as really cool, so I could get the Gettysburg Address. If I did, what I would do, and I do this with a lot of non-state records, is I would accept it. If somebody's donating it to the Illinois State Archives, I would accept it, but under the premise, I'm gonna find a good home for it. And in this case, every state, the way they do their history stuff is a little bit different. In Illinois, you've got the State Archives for official state records, and then you have the Illinois Historical Library, which right now is under the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and they collect non-official state history type records, letters, diaries, photographs, just not official records. And and obviously a huge Lincoln collection, a huge Civil War collection. So if somebody said, do you want this? I would take it. And then that would most likely be where I would send it. But that's always my favorite example of things we don't collect is the Gettysburg Address. So great question. There's a question here on, are there any other state archive virtual or history events where we can learn more? Boy, good question. I don't have anything, Izzy. Thank you again for asking the question. We're trying to put certainly more of our documents online. I mean, this is a exhibit, but we have many of our records online for researchers, and you can make of that what you want. Of course, there's a real effort before the COVID hit, and certainly since the COVID hit, of museums and historic societies and archives trying to put more and more stuff online. And we're trying that as well. But in terms of exhibits for us, right now, this is it. In about a year or two, we're gonna have that photo collection from the state photographer online, and that's just gonna be wonderful. There's a lot of grip and grin type pictures, you know, the governor shaking hands with, you know, the local PTA who visits or a band or whatever, but there's a lot of great photos in there. And people, one thing I've learned, I'll tell you a lesson I learned. I showed you a photo of the reversal of the Chicago River. We've got 20,000 photos going from the 1890s to the 1920s dealing with the reversal of the Chicago River. They were documenting what an amazing event it was to reverse a river and also trying to protect themselves from lawsuits. And I was so excited to get the collection. We got the collection and I started going through it, some 20,000 photo negatives. And I got to tell you, I was just like bored to tears. It's like, it's just pictures of cornfields and pictures of, you know, workers digging a canal, and I was bored to tears. And I was kind of disappointed. And about 2 or 3 years later, someone came up and said, hey, we're doing a book on the reversal of the Chicago River. Can we go through these negatives? And they went through them. We gave them carte blanche to go through them. And they came out with one of the all-time greatest books I've ever seen. I mean, on the reversal of the Chicago River and all that it entailed, and not just entailed, but the environmental effects. It was a great book. And I learned such a valuable lesson there, which is, you know, one man's trash is another man's gold, I guess. What I found kind of boring, they turned into a great book. And the same thing would apply to maybe the photographs of what we call the Doc Helm collection from the state photographer. A lot of grip and grins, but somebody could take that and make that into something great. That's the beauty of doing research, and that's the beauty of researchers. Everybody looks at things different and in a unique way. That's actually the beauty of working in an archives. We preserve the records so that the public can use them however they wish. And also, by the way, I don't know if you've noticed, but archivists, like librarians, don't get a chance to talk a lot. So rather than just say yes or no, I took 5 minutes to answer your question, but this is my chance to talk a lot. So I'm going to take advantage of it. Right, George?
Yes, absolutely. And we do have another question here about New Salem. Do you see that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't realize to scroll down. Thank you, Noreen, by the way, and everybody else. You mentioned New Salem was in Sangamon County. Drew and Linda Neff, great question. It was in Sangamon County. So Illinois, if you remember the first document I showed you, had 2 counties at the time. And when Illinois became a state, we had 15 counties. As Illinois expanded, the counties would be divided more and more. So when Lincoln moved to New Salem, it was part of Sangamon County. And then Lincoln actually had to draw the legislation and created, basically the counties would be subdivided to make them smaller and easier to get to the county seat, which was so important. That's where the clerk's office was. So counties were continually divided. And the last county, the 102nd county, was created in 1859. So New Salem, which was only around in the 1830s, was originally in Sangamon County, and that was a huge county. There were 9 legislators from Sangamon County alone, which is what helped get Springfield to be the state capital. But Lincoln had to draw the legislation to divide Sangamon County, and politically it was a very risky thing to do. He couldn't take too much from Sangamon County because that would make those voters mad at him, but he couldn't give it too much because what's the point? So what he did, and a very politically smart move, he put himself in charge of the committee. And then when he redrew the lines for Sangamon County, and then he created Menard County, which is Petersburg, and that's where New Salem is now. And then also Christian County, I think, was a part of that legislation. But he took control of it. He didn't duck and run. He took control of it to make sure it would help him politically. But it was a very difficult decision for him to do. But so anyway, that's an example of New Salem being in Sangamon County. And then just a few years later, there's a new county. And if you do research, genealogical research, sometimes it means you have to move courthouses because if your family might not have moved, but the county lines might have changed. So if your family was in this house in 1820, it might be in Randolph County. And if it was in the same house in 1830, it might be in Monroe County, for example. We do have a book, I think it's online, but we do have a free pamphlet, The History of Illinois Counties, that has maps of all the changes through 1859, of all the legislation and maps showing how the county lines change. It's a very good booklet that we came out with. Drew and Linda Neff, did I answer long enough for you? Thank you for your question.